The evening sun bled into the horizon, spilling golden light across the endless stretch of the ranch. The girl stood at the gate with her shoulders hunched, her face smeared with dust, her clothes torn and frayed at the edges. She had walked for miles, and every step carried the weight of defeat and hunger. Her voice trembled when she finally found the courage to speak, though she hardly lifted her eyes. "All I need is a corner to sleep," she whispered, "and scraps, if there are any left." The rancher, tall and stern, regarded her with the cautious gaze of a man who had seen too many strangers drift by. His hands were calloused from years of work, and his face was shaded by both his hat and his guarded nature. He was not a cruel man, but trust was a currency he rarely spent. He cleared his throat, ready to tell her the barn might be good enough for someone like her, when a small voice cut through the air. "Papa," came the call, light and eager. The rancher's daughter ran out from the porch, her hair tumbling in wild curls, her eyes brighter than the evening sky. She was young, perhaps 5 at most, and her innocence often softened her father's edges. She stopped at the stranger's side, tilting her head as though studying a mystery. Then, with the unflinching honesty only a child could possess, she smiled and said, "Mama." The girl froze. The rancher stiffened, his jaw tightening as if bracing against a blow. Silence wrapped around them, heavy and thick, broken only by the rustle of dry grass in the breeze. The rancher bent, gently placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "She's not," he began, but the little one pulled free, her tiny hand reaching for the stranger's torn dress. "She is," the child insisted, her voice soft but sure, as though her heart had recognized something her mind could not explain. "She's my mama." The stranger's throat tightened. Her hands trembled, and for a moment, she thought of fleeing, of escaping the weight of such words. Yet something in the girl's eyes rooted her in place. It had been years since anyone had looked at her with such hope, such pure belief. She had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted, not for labor, not for pity, but simply for being. The rancher's eyes softened despite himself. He saw the weariness etched into the young woman's frame, but he also saw the way his daughter clung to her, as if she had found a missing piece. Against his better judgment, he said, "Come inside. You'll eat with us tonight." The stranger blinked, stunned. For the first time in a long while, she felt warmth seep into her bones. Inside the ranch house, the smells of stew and freshly baked bread pulled at her senses. She sat at the wooden table, awkward in the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The child slipped onto her knee as though she had always belonged there. Through the meal, the girl kept calling her, "Mama." The rancher tried correcting her, but every time, his daughter's wide eyes filled with confusion, and his own heart faltered. Slowly, as laughter returned to the little one's face, he allowed the word to linger in the air, filling spaces in the home that had long been empty. That night, when the stranger was shown a room instead of a corner, she wept silently into the pillow. Not from sorrow, but from the fragile, terrifying seed of hope that had taken root inside her. She had asked for scraps and a corner to sleep, but in the warmth of a child's voice, she had been given far more than she had ever dared to dream. The night was quiet on the ranch, so quiet that the sound of the wind brushing against the wooden walls felt almost like a lullaby. She lay on the bed, stiff and uncertain, her heart beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had not known the softness of a mattress in months, perhaps years, and though her body ached for rest, her mind would not let her surrender so easily. She feared that come morning, she would be sent away, that this fragile mercy was nothing more than a passing kindness. But in the middle of the night, the door creaked open. Small feet padded across the wooden floor, and the little girl climbed up beside her without hesitation, curling against her as if she had done it all her life. The warmth of that small body pressed against her, the trust so freely given, unraveled something inside her chest. She lay awake, holding the child, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to close her eyes without fear. Morning came with the rooster's crow, with the golden spill of sunlight through thin curtains, and with the child's laughter echoing in the room. The rancher stood at the door, arms crossed, watching his daughter chatter away as though she had known this stranger forever. His jaw tightened, but when his eyes met the young woman's, he said nothing harsh. Only a quiet, "Breakfast is ready." The days that followed became a rhythm she had not expected. She tried to keep to herself, sweeping the floor, washing dishes, tending to chores no one asked her to do, as if proving her worth might let her stay a little longer. But the child never let her stay in the background. Each morning she would tug at her hand, pulling her outside to watch the horses, or inside to braid her hair with clumsy fingers, or into the kitchen to sit beside her while they ate. It was the way the little girl laughed that softened the silence between her and the rancher. He would sit across the table, eyes flicking to the stranger more often than he admitted to himself, watching the way his daughter's happiness seemed to bloom brighter whenever she was near. And though his heart was guarded, he could not ignore the change. One evening, after a long day, he found her out by the barn. She had rolled up her sleeves and was fixing a broken hinge on the stall door, her hands steady despite the dirt and sweat. He leaned against the post, arms folded, and said quietly, "Most folks would have just asked me to do it." She startled, wiping her hands on her skirt, unsure if she had overstepped. "I didn't mean," but he shook his head. "It's not a complaint. Just, you work hard for someone who asked for scraps in a corner." Her lips trembled, but she held his gaze. "I've lived off less. I don't want to be a burden. I only wanted a place where I could breathe without fear." Something in her voice struck him, something raw and unspoken. He wanted to ask, but he stopped himself, sensing that her past was a wound not easily uncovered. Instead, he nodded and let the silence stand between them, filled only by the distant sound of horses. Nights grew softer in the house. The child no longer asked, "Can she stay?" Because she had stopped asking altogether, she simply assumed she would. And every time she called her, "Mama," the word dug deeper into the young woman's heart, a word that belonged to someone she had once been, or perhaps someone she had always longed to be. The rancher wrestled with it in quiet moments. His wife had been gone for years, lost in childbirth, leaving him to raise his daughter alone. He had built walls around his heart as strong as the fences around his land, but now those walls were shifting, challenged by the stranger who had stumbled into their lives with nothing but empty hands and weary eyes. One stormy night, thunder rolling heavy across the sky, the child woke crying. She clung to the young woman's neck, trembling, whispering, "Mama, don't let go." And in that instant, she knew there was no turning back. She soothed the child until she slept again, her hand brushing back wild curls, her own tears falling silently onto the pillow. When she looked up, she saw him standing in the doorway, his face shadowed but his eyes clear. He didn't speak, didn't question, only nodded once before closing the door again. That simple gesture was louder than words. It was permission, or perhaps acknowledgement, that her place here was no longer a question. As weeks turned into months, the ranch itself seemed to accept her. She moved through the kitchen with ease, her laughter blending with the child's, her presence softening the air in ways the rancher could not deny. She learned the rhythm of the land, the work of the horses, the hum of the fields. And though she had come asking for scraps, she gave in return more than anyone had expected. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in fire, the rancher found her sitting on the porch, the child asleep in her lap. He sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence. For a long while, they said nothing. Then he asked, his voice low, "Do you ever think of leaving?" She looked down at the child's peaceful face, then out at the horizon. "Every day," she admitted. "Because I don't know if I deserve this." He turned to her, his voice firm. "Deserve has nothing to do with it. My daughter calls you Mama because her heart chose you. And he hesitated, the words heavy, but he pushed them through. "I'm starting to think my heart did too." Her breath caught, and the silence that followed was filled with the soft rustle of the evening wind. She had come to this place asking for scraps in a corner, yet here she was, holding more than she had ever thought possible. The days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months, each one stitching her more firmly into the fabric of the ranch. Where once she had hovered on the edges of the household, unsure of her place, now her footsteps carried familiarity. She knew the squeak of the back door, the groan of the floorboard by the stove, the way the wind funneled through the north windows when storms came rolling down from the mountains. She knew how the rancher took his coffee, black, with no sugar, and how his daughter needed honey drizzled on her bread to coax her into finishing her meal. What surprised her most was how quickly the ranch itself began to feel like a home. The scent of hay and leather that filled the barns, the way the earth seemed to hum after a hard rain, the chorus of cicadas in the heat of summer, all of it seeped into her bones until she could no longer remember what life had been before. Perhaps it was because she had spent so long drifting, with no place to anchor her, that the solidity of the ranch felt like a miracle. But miracles had their shadows. She carried secrets in her chest, ones she could not bring herself to share. At night, when the child nestled close and the rancher's steady footsteps faded down the hall, she would stare at the ceiling and remember. Remember the years of hunger, the cruelty of those who had turned her away, the nights she had curled under bridges with nothing but scraps of cloth to keep the cold at bay. She had survived, but survival had come at the cost of trust. To give her heart over fully to this place, to these people, terrified her more than hunger ever had. The rancher, too, wrestled with unspoken thoughts. He had spent years building his world around fences, real and imagined. The loss of his wife had cut him deep, and he had vowed never to open himself again to such pain. Yet here she was, a slip of a girl with weary eyes, breaking through his defenses not with force but with kindness. He saw it in the way his daughter's laughter had returned, fuller and freer than it had been in years. He saw it in the way the house, once quiet and echoing with absence, now rang with small joys. He wanted to trust her, but fear whispered that if she vanished, his daughter would break, and perhaps he would too. One afternoon in late autumn, the air crisp and sharp with the promise of winter, she was out gathering eggs from the henhouse when the child came running, breathless with excitement. "Mama, Papa says the horses need feeding, and he wants you to come too." She froze at the word, as she always did, but the little girl didn't notice. Her small hand reached up, pulling insistently, and soon enough she was walking toward the corral, the child skipping beside her. The rancher was already there, tossing hay into the troughs. His movements were steady, practiced, but when his eyes met hers, something softer flickered. He handed her a pitchfork. "You ever fed horses before?" She shook her head. "Then you'll learn today." Together they worked, the child darting between them, giggling as the horses nudged at her hair. She found herself laughing too, the sound foreign and almost startling on her own lips. The rancher glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. It wasn't a smile, not fully, but it was close, and it sent a warmth through her she hadn't expected. That night, by the fire, the little girl curled into her lap, drowsy from the day's play. The rancher sat across from them, the flames painting gold across his face. For a long time they sat in silence, the crackle of wood the only sound. Then, his voice low, he asked, "Where were you headed, that night you came here?" Her chest tightened. She stared at the fire, struggling for words. "Nowhere," she whispered at last. "I wasn't headed anywhere. I was just trying to survive." He nodded slowly, as though he had expected as much. "You don't owe me your story. But I want you to know, you don't have to keep running anymore." Her eyes stung, but she said nothing. The child stirred in her arms, sighing softly, and she kissed the crown of her head. She thought of what it meant, to not have to keep running. She wasn't sure she could believe it yet, but the seed of the thought burrowed deep. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the fields, turning the ranch into a quiet, white world. Inside the house, warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. She spent the days baking bread, stitching torn clothes, helping mend harnesses, always finding some way to make herself useful. But usefulness had turned into something else, belonging. The child clung to her with an unshakable devotion, and the rancher began to look at her not as a guest, nor even as an interloper, but as something more. One evening, when the snow howled against the windows, the child fell ill. Her fever burned hot, her small body trembling. Panic lit the rancher's face, a fear he had not shown in years. He paced the floor, muttering, helpless, until she took charge, her voice steady despite her own racing heart. She cooled the girl's forehead with damp cloths, coaxed her to sip water, sang softly to lull her when the pain made her cry. Through the long hours of the night, she held the child close, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since she was a little girl herself. At dawn, the fever finally broke. The child slept peacefully, her breathing even once more. The rancher sank into the chair beside the bed, his head in his hands. When he lifted his face, his eyes were raw with emotion. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as a stranger, not as someone passing through, but as the one who had saved his heart's greatest treasure. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said, his voice rough. She met his gaze, her own throat tight. "You'll never have to find out." Something passed between them in that moment. Unspoken but undeniable. It was more binding than promises, more powerful than fear. It was the quiet understanding of two souls who had both known loss, both carried burdens, and yet somehow had found each other in the wide, unforgiving world. Spring came, melting the snow, filling the streams with rushing water. Life surged through the ranch again, green and alive. She worked beside him in the fields now, no longer just a helper in the kitchen but a partner in the rhythm of the land. The child grew stronger, her laughter carrying across the yard like music. And with each passing day, the word, Mama, no longer felt like a mistake. It felt like truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blazed with colors, the rancher stood on the porch, watching her chase the child through the grass. Their laughter mingled, bright and free. His heart swelled with a mixture of awe and fear because he knew what he felt now, and awe because he could no longer deny it. When she finally returned to the porch, breathless and flushed, he reached for her hand. "You asked for scraps in a corner," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But what you've given us, it's more than I ever thought we'd have again. You've brought back laughter to this house. You've given my daughter a mother. And you've given me," he faltered, but then steadied. "You've given me hope." Her breath caught, tears welling in her eyes. She had come here expecting nothing, ready to live in shadows, but this man's words lit a fire inside her, one she had thought long extinguished. She didn't answer with words. She simply squeezed his hand, her eyes shining, the child's laughter ringing around them like a blessing. And though she had asked for scraps in a corner, what she had been given was a place at the table, a place in their hearts, and a love that felt as wide and unshakable as the land itself. The ranch had always been quiet, its rhythms predictable, horses to feed at dawn, fences to mend in the afternoon, the lonely hush of nights broken only by coyotes in the distance. But now the silence was different. It was softer. It was filled with the sound of the child's laughter, the murmur of a woman's voice humming in the kitchen, the gentle creak of footsteps in a hallway that had been too empty for too long. The sound of the child's laughter, the murmur of a woman's voice humming in the kitchen, the gentle creak of footsteps in a hallway that had been too empty for too long. He had told himself it was temporary, that this stranger with tired eyes and worn shoes would leave once she found her strength again. Yet weeks had turned to months, and she had not left. More importantly, his daughter did not let her leave her side. She had arrived with nothing but desperation, asking only for scraps in a corner. He had thought she would fade into the background, but instead she seemed to breathe life into everything she touched. The table that had once been bare and silent now felt like a place of warmth. The child who had grown too quiet in her loneliness now clung to her with trust so complete that he could hardly separate the two anymore. And he found himself watching her when he shouldn't, listening for her voice when she wasn't near, carrying her presence with him into the fields, the barns, the still moments before sleep. But he was cautious. Life had taught him that joy could be taken as swiftly as it came. He had buried his wife years ago, and with her he had buried the part of himself that believed in second chances. Or so he had thought. One evening, the sun low and red on the horizon, he saw her standing by the fence, brushing one of the mares. Her hair, tangled from the wind, fell across her face, and yet there was a peace in her expression he hadn't seen before. The child was chasing fireflies nearby, her laughter rising into the air like a song. Something inside him shifted at the sight, and it scared him as much as it moved him. "You've taken to the horses quick," he said, stepping closer. She glanced at him, her hands steady on the brush. "They're easier than people. They don't ask questions." "Neither do I," he replied. Her lips curved, though it wasn't quite a smile. "You don't have to. Your eyes do all the asking." The truth of it struck him. He did want to ask. Where had she come from? What pain had carved those shadows under her eyes? What dreams had been stolen from her? But he also knew that sometimes wounds weren't ready for words. So he only nodded, letting the silence stretch between them, filled by the soft sound of the horse's steady breathing. It was the child who bridged the distance between them, as she always did. Running up with glowing fireflies cupped in her hands, she shouted, "Mama, look. They're little stars that fell down." She opened her palms, releasing the tiny lights, and both adults watched as the creatures floated away into the evening. The girl clung to her skirt, her eyes full of certainty, calling her mama as though no other word could exist. And she didn't correct her. Not anymore. That night, when the girl finally slept, she lingered by the child's bed, smoothing back curls with fingers trembling from tenderness. When she turned, he was standing in the doorway, silent, watching. You don't stop her anymore, he said quietly. She looked down. I can't. Every time she calls me that, it feels like something I lost a long time ago is being given back to me. His throat tightened, but he didn't push. He only said, maybe it's not about what you lost. Maybe it's about what you've found. The days blurred with work. Winter loosened its grip, and spring came with new life. Calves were born, foals stumbled in the fields, and the land woke up again. She worked beside him now, not as a guest, not as someone who owed him, but as though the ranch belonged to her too. He found himself depending on her presence, not because he couldn't manage without her, but because everything was better with her near. One morning, he watched her teaching his daughter how to knead bread. Flour dusted both of them, laughter filling the kitchen. He thought of how empty this house had been before her, how heavy the silence had weighed on him. He thought of how his daughter's eyes had once carried a loneliness no child should bear. And he realized with a clarity that startled him, this woman hadn't just come into their lives, she had stitched them back together. But still, she held back. He saw it in the way her smile sometimes faltered, in how her gaze lingered on the horizon as though she expected something, or someone, from her past to appear and drag her away. One evening, he found her outside, arms wrapped around herself as the sky darkened. Storm's coming, he said. Maybe, she murmured. Then, after a pause, do you ever wonder if happiness is just borrowed? If it's only a matter of time before it's taken back? The question pierced him. He stepped closer, his voice steady. Happiness isn't borrowed. It's built. And no one's taking this from us unless we let them. Her eyes shimmered in the fading light, and for a heartbeat he thought she might tell him everything. But she only nodded, swallowing back words she couldn't yet say. That night, the storm broke, rain hammering against the roof, wind rattling the windows. The child woke frightened, crawling into her bed and clinging tight. She held her close, whispering lullabies, smoothing her hair. When she looked up, he was there again, in the doorway, his expression unguarded. For a moment, it was as though the storm outside had been silenced by the stillness between them. He took a step inside. Another. And then, very softly, he said, you don't have to carry it all alone. Her tears fell then, though she turned her face away. He didn't press, didn't demand. He simply reached for her hand where it rested on the child's back, and the warmth of his touch was enough to remind her that she wasn't as alone as she feared. The weeks after the storm were gentler. Something unspoken had shifted, and though neither named it, both felt it. They moved like two rivers slowly joining, their lives entwining more naturally with each day. The child was the bridge, but there was more now, something that lived in every glance, every shared silence, every moment when their hands brushed and neither pulled away. One evening in summer, when the fields were high and golden, they rode out together, the child perched in front of him on the saddle, her laughter ringing through the open air. She watched them from her own horse, her hair loose in the wind, her smile radiant in the sunset. And in that moment, he knew he was no longer afraid. Afraid of loss, afraid of love, afraid of daring to hope again. Because hope was already here, alive in the two souls who had filled the empty spaces of his life. When they returned to the ranch, the child was dozing, her head on his shoulder. He carried her inside, tucking her into bed, then found her waiting on the porch. The air was warm, fireflies drifting like sparks. He stood beside her, silent for a long time. Then he spoke. You asked me once if happiness was borrowed. I think you have your answer now. It's not borrowed. It's here. It's real. She turned to him, her eyes luminous in the firefly glow. And though she had come asking for scraps in a corner, she now knew she had been given something far greater, a place, a family, a love that was no longer a dream.